Okay. I want to start by talking about the meaning of the 2020 election. And to put it in context, to quote just a snippet from the book that was mentioned a moment ago, Democracy for Realists, my former teacher, Chris Achen, and I write, election outcomes are mostly just erratic reflections of the current balance of partisan loyalties in a given political system. In a two-party system with competitive elections, that means that the choice between the candidates is essentially a coin toss. Elections that throw the bums out typically do not produce genuine policy mandates, not even when they're landslides. They simply put a different elite coalition in charge. It is a blunder to expect elections to deliver more. And as you can see from this graph of the historical trend in the partisan balance in presidential elections, the period that we're in now really is a period of unusual partisan balance. The last 25 years have been marked by a whole series of relatively close presidential elections, a series unparalleled since the end of the late 19th century. So the outcomes of recent presidential elections in a global sense really have been essentially coin tosses. Of course, the recent electoral history of the United States has been marked prominently by the rise of Donald Trump in 2016. The remarkable thing about the 2016 election, I think, is that about 90% of Republicans voted for Trump, just as they had for other recent nominees, notwithstanding his inexperience and his extraordinary personal failings. The graph here shows the relationship between each state's vote in the 2012 election for Mitt Romney and their vote for Donald Trump in 2016. You can see that the results look very similar, obviously, except for the fact that the coin toss in 2016 was in the Republicans' favor rather than the Democrats. But given the stability of the results, in spite of how unusual Trump was as a candidate, political scientists mostly concluded that partisanship is a powerful drug. Then we had the Trump administration. You all have some memories of how that went. And then in the last year of Trump's presidency, the COVID pandemic, which by the time of the 2020 election had killed almost 250,000 Americans. But again, the most remarkable thing is that in spite of all of that, the reaction of the public was essentially flat. This is the trend in approval, the red line, and disapproval, the blue line of President Trump in all the polls that were conducted over the course of his presidency up till the 2020 election. You can see that in spite of all the events of his administration, there was really very little aggregate change in approval or disapproval for Trump through his entire time in office. And if anything, the people who voted for Trump in 2016 were actually more favorable toward him in 2020 than they had been in 2016. These are survey results based on the responses of people who were interviewed repeatedly over the course of President Trump's time in office. And you can see that in most cases, their opinions of him as a person and a leader are, if anything, a little more positive in 2020 than they had been in 2016. And the 2020 exit polls suggest that voters were almost exactly evenly split, both on their assessment of the response to the pandemic. There you see, 51% saying that US efforts to contain the coronavirus were going somewhat well or very well. And similarly, in terms of the performance of the economy, 49% said that the condition of the economy at the time of the 2020 election was good or excellent. And of course, in both cases, the vast majority of those people voted to re-elect the president. And this time, the state-by-state results were even more stable than they had been in 2016. Only a handful of states and none of the battleground states saw shifts of more than a few percentage points in Trump's margin. So partisanship has, if anything, become an even more powerful drug in 2020 than it had been in 2016. And again, this is a continuation of a trend that's been noticeable for the past 25 or 30 years. What I'm showing you here is a measure of partisan continuity, how much the partisan loyalties of the electorate in each election seem to carry over in subsequent elections. And you can see at the right end of the graph in recent elections, we've had a consistently high level of partisan continuity again, probably unmatched since the turn of the previous century. And that stability is especially surprising in light of the massive increase in turnout in the 2020 election. Another one of the things that I think was most surprising about the election is that Trump managed to find 11 million more votes in 2020 than he had gotten in 2016. Of course, Biden received more than 15 million more votes than Hillary Clinton had. And in both cases, I think that higher turnout is a testament to the intensity of feelings in the public as a whole and on both sides of the partisan divide, and to the massive mobilization efforts on both sides, which drew previously unengaged voters out of the woodwork. But now the election's over and we're thinking about where we are in terms of government. As almost always happens, when a liberal president takes office, liberals are enthusiastic about the prospects for major change. Here are some examples from the days right after the 2020 election. There was a lot more enthusiasm before the 2020 election, but the surprising closeness of the result, I think, tempered expectations a little bit, but there was still a lot of talk of this sort. Biden can't be FDR. He could still be LBJ. He has the power to make transformational progress look like come on man common sense. That conveniently overlooks the fact that LBJ had been elected in one of the largest landslides in American electoral history and had Democratic caucuses in both the House and the Senate that were as large as any that we'd seen since the New Deal, whereas Biden was elected with a narrow majority in the House and a tied Senate. Nonetheless, activists thought that he ought to push full speed ahead. Democrats have a once-in-a-generation moment to deliver policies at the scale of the crises our generation is facing. Young people helped deliver this historic majority to Joe Biden. The Senate cannot be an excuse whether or not Mitch McConnell remains the majority leader. This was written before the last Senate election results in Georgia, obviously. But I can tell you that the Senate is going to be an excuse for some degree of inaction, in spite of the fact that Mitch McConnell is not the majority leader. In order to see how that works, we have to talk a little bit about government and the policymaking process. This is, I think, the most important summary of the state of representation in contemporary American politics. What I'm showing you here is a measure along the horizontal axis of the policy preferences and attitudes of the voters in each congressional district in the country based on their responses to about a dozen salient, prominent policy questions. So the most liberal districts are on the left and the most conservative districts are on the right. And then on the vertical axis is a summary measure of the behavior of the representatives from those districts in Congress over an entire 2-year period based on the roll call votes they cast on everything that came up before Congress. And you can see that within each party, there's a modest positive relationship between the preferences of constituents and the behavior of their elected officials. But in both cases, it's a pretty modest relationship. And the difference between a typical Democrat and a typical Republican representing essentially politically identical districts in the middle of the picture there is vastly larger than the difference in behavior between a Democrat representing the most liberal district in the country and a Democrat representing the most conservative district in the country. So regardless of what their voters think, politicians are pretty free to do what they want, and what they want is, at least in the current environment, pretty well predicted by whether they're Republicans or Democrats. Much the same thing is true of presidents. Here's a graph going back to the 1980s that shows the positions of Republican and Democratic presidential candidates on maybe the most important economic issue of the times, government spending, by comparison with the position of swing voters. So the people in the middle of the electorate are indicated by the purple dashed line. The positions of the Republican presidential candidates are the red lines, and the positions of the Democratic presidential candidates are the blue lines. And you can see that continuously there's a huge gap between both parties' presidential candidates' positions and the positions of voters in the middle of the political spectrum. And if anything, those gaps have been increasing recently. And I want to say that although we sometimes think that responsiveness to the public is the most important thing in democracy, sometimes it's just as well, at least in my view, that candidates don't take the positions that are suggested by the positions of the voters in the middle of the spectrum. Here's a similar kind of picture for the question about aid to minorities, whether the government should be helping Blacks and other minorities to get ahead. This is the most consistent and largest disparity between the positions of the public and the positions of presidential candidates is the liberalism of Democratic presidential candidates on that issue. From my point of view, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. If people voted as they're often portrayed on the basis of ideology and policy, that simply wouldn't be possible. Candidates' failures to reflect the positions of swing voters would indeed be punished at the polls, but people mostly don't vote on the basis of ideology or policy. And as a result, politicians in office are mostly free to do what they want. And so the liberal policy agendas of Democratic presidents are mostly constrained not directly by the public, but by insufficiently liberal senators. I think a good example here is Joe Lieberman from Connecticut sinking the public option when President Obama was in office. Lieberman was not being pushed to the right by the voters of Connecticut. He just happened to think that was a bad policy idea. And similarly, conservative policy agendas of Republican presidents are mostly constrained by insufficiently conservative senators. And there an obvious example is John McCain, who sunk the repeal of the Affordable Care Act in spite of representing the very conservative state of Arizona. But the middle does mostly rule in legislative politics. If you think back to President Obama's major legislative initiatives, every one of them passed with exactly as many votes as they needed in the Senate to pass it. And that means that for all practical purposes, the 51st senator, roughly Joe Manchin, is the pivotal voter on issues that aren't available for a filibuster, and that the 60th most liberal senator, who for all practical purposes is Mitch McConnell, is going to be pivotal on issues where the filibuster is potentially in play. And that's going to be the main constraint on how liberal President Biden's policy agenda is going to turn out to be. I also want to say a little bit about Republicans and Democrats and how they think and the differences between them, since it's clear that we live in a very polarized partisan age. And I want to do that by thinking about three broad bundles of political values. First of all, I'll talk about economic conservatism, and I'll measure that based on a whole series of questions and surveys about the role of government and regulation, healthcare, the environment, business versus unions, rich versus poor, and so on. Secondly, a bundle of issues touching on what I'll call cultural conservatism, which have to do with patriotism, hard work, religion, morality, rural versus urban interests, guns, antipathy toward journalists, and sadly, yes, to college professors, and then issues like abortion and the role of women. And then third and finally, a bundle of issues that I'll refer to as ethnic antagonism. Issues like immigration, affirmative action, welfare, white identity, concerns about the social role and political power of Blacks and Latinos, and so on.
Larry, could I just interrupt you for a moment? And they would like you to move your microphone a little closer to your mouth because the sound is choppy.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, keep going. Just stay close.
Maybe my voice is choppy.
There you go.
Okay, sorry about that. So if we think about the relationship between partisan preferences and positions in these different attitude domains, it turns out that among Democrats, partisan attitudes are most strongly related to attitudes about economic issues and the role of government, and cultural values and ethnic antagonisms are distinctly less important. So a lot of Democrats, when they're thinking about Republicans, ask, why are these Republicans voting for things that don't seem to be in their economic interests? Well, the reason is that for Republicans, the priorities are very different. In general, on average, they tend not to care very much about the role of government or economic issues, but care much more about these cultural values. And so successful Republican presidents, and especially President Trump, have succeeded by appealing to Republicans on the basis of cultural concerns more than anything else. Oh, I should also just say, in thinking about partisan polarization, I think it's important, therefore, to bear in mind that the nature of partisan polarization isn't just Democrats and Republicans disagreeing about political issues. It's disagreeing about what politics is about in a pretty fundamental way. And I think those kinds of disagreements are both more confusing and more troubling to people and maybe harder to bridge. So that brings us to the events of January 6th. I want to say a little bit about that in the context of a survey that I conducted a year ago, a year before the events, back in January of 2020, in which I asked a national sample of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents some questions that touched on their allegiance to democratic values of various kinds. So here are examples of the questions. It's hard to trust the results of elections when so many people will vote for anyone who offers a handout. This was before the months of harping by the president and Republicans in Congress about the prospects of election fraud in the 2020 election. But even at that point, about 75% of Republicans and Republican leaners agreed that it was hard to trust the results of elections. So the argument about election fraud fell on very fertile seeds in the Republican rank and file. The traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. A slight majority of Republicans agreed with that one. And about 40% agreed that a time will come when patriotic Americans have to take the law into their own hands. It seems to me that these are the kinds of attitudes that formed a basis for the events of January 6th in two senses. First of all, because these are widespread views, but there are certainly smaller numbers of people who hold similar views to more extreme degrees. Those are the kinds of people who were most likely to actually engage in anti-democratic action on January 6th. But secondly, because it seems likely that the widespread nature of these kinds of views among the party rank and file is likely to encourage anti-democratic behavior by the political leaders who are attached to these parties. And we saw a good deal of that as well. Another maybe troubling point here is that these anti-democratic sentiments seem not to be primarily attached to cultural issues, as with support for Trump and support for the Republican Party, but rather specifically to ethnic antagonisms. The kinds of Republicans who were most likely to endorse those anti-democratic sentiments were the ones who were most concerned about immigration and affirmative action and the idea that whites were being discriminated against. So I think this is a much more specifically grounded concern than the general cultural concerns that have mostly driven support for Trump and for the Republican Party. I also want to show you that unlike the cultural and economic conservatism, Republicans' ethnic antagonism doesn't seem to be very strongly differentiated by generations until you get to the much younger cohorts. This is a picture of the average levels of cultural conservatism and economic conservatism and ethnic antagonism among Republicans, ordered from oldest to youngest by their birth dates. And you can see that there are pretty significant drops in cultural conservatism and economic conservatism as we go from people born before 1950 to people born in the 1970s, say. But over that same set of cohorts, there's really no diminution at all in the average level of ethnic antagonism. So I think these concerns are going to be with us for some time to come. They're unlikely to decline very quickly, at least in the next 20 years or so. So while many Democrats have talked about the prospect of increasing demographic diversity as guaranteeing a durable new Democratic majority, I think, at least in the short run, it's probably likely that Republicans will benefit from the intense support of whites who are agitated by a half century of disorienting social and cultural change and by the threatening prospect of more change to come. Broadly speaking, the historical track record of multi-ethnic democracies is not encouraging, just looking around the world and looking at our own history. And so the next 20 or 30 years may see even more of the political turmoil that we've experienced recently. Now, that's all very troubling, but I want to bring you back to the broader theoretical picture. This is another snippet quotation in Democracy for Realists from the political philosopher John Donne, who wrote, "To be ruled is both necessary and inherently discomforting as well as dangerous. For our rulers to be accountable to us softens its intrinsic humiliations, probably sets some hazy limits to the harms that they will voluntarily choose to do to us collectively, and thus diminishes some of the dangers to which their rule may expose us. To suggest that we can never hope to have the power to make them act just as we would wish them to suggests that it is really we, not they, who are ruling. This is an illusion, and probably a somewhat malign illusion, either a self-deception or an instance of being deceived by others, or very probably both." Achen and I refer to this in our book as the folk theory of democracy, the idea that ordinary people can control their governors. For the most part, they can't. They can make some difference at the margin. And I think the difference they make at the margin is likely to be more constructive if they take account of their actual role in the democratic process. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. That was terrific. Not an upbeat assessment, but an accurate one. And everybody, Larry makes this look so easy, but this is a lot of data he showed you. He just put it in a really elegant form, and a lifetime of decades of studying American democracy, public opinion, partisanship. So thanks, Larry, for streamlining it all for us. But there's a lot here. So I want you to pull back very far, and I know that you're a student of history, especially the history of American democracy, and talk a little bit about the founders and what they didn't predict, and what their greatest failing was in terms of trying to predict practical democracy, democratic action, and what the Constitution looks like. Can you talk a little bit about what you've learned in terms of that gap?
I think one thing they didn't predict certainly was the rise of political parties, and that's been an important problem for democracy at various times in American history, and it has been again in recent years. But I think the other thing that they didn't expect or build a system to account for is the ideal that we often think of as the ideal of democracy in contemporary society. Their idea of what their government was supposed to accomplish was not to give people direct control over public policy. And the system that they designed was in some ways, much less small d democratic than the system that we've evolved subsequently. The course of political reform has mostly been that when things go wrong, people have pushed to fix them by making the system more democratic in one way or another. And so a lot of the safeguards against the excesses of democracy that the founders built into the system have been relaxed, or we built workarounds of one kind or another to try to make a system that's more consistent with contemporary notions of populist democratic control.
I think most people, even those who were, political science majors back in college, don't know that parties were a later development. So you talk about when that starts to happen, and it seems unbelievable to us now that there were not parties.
Yeah, in some sense, it started to happen almost immediately. President Washington gave his famous farewell address that warned against the problems that would arise if the leaders of the country divided themselves into competing factions. But as soon as he was off the scene, they were at each other, disagreeing about the major political issues that arose in the first years of the constitutional system. And the election of 1800 pitted the Federalists against the Republicans in a very contentious, very close election, maybe the first significant electoral crisis in American history, and still one of the most serious. we managed to get through that. And as a result, the party system then developed and expanded, mostly in the 1820s and 30s, I suppose, expanded to the mass level as the members of Congress in each of these factions competed to try to mobilize voters on their side and get more of their number elected to Congress. And so the party system has evolved from there. But there have been ups and downs in terms of the nature of the competition between the parties and the extent of differences between them. And in the last 30 years or so, we've seen a marked increase in the level of partisan polarization as measured by the difference in policy preferences between Democrats and Republicans in Congress, and as measured by the attitudes of rank and file Democrats and Republicans in terms of their attitudes toward their own party and the other party.
Yeah, I think that there's been so much recent talk about the Senate and what it's supposed to do. A lot of us grew up, Larry and I, thinking that the Senate was this more of a rational body, a body that builds consensus, that can compromise. The House is what it is. The House looks a little crazy and circus-like, where the representatives, they tend to be more extreme and a little bit kind of wilder in their presentation. And they don't have that, each one of them doesn't have that much influence as compared to the Senate, which we've always thought would be the cooling down body. And I believe that's what the founders thought as well, but hasn't turned out that way. And there is, I think, over these next couple of years, especially, going to be so much push and pull about the Senate, and everybody paying a lot of attention to Joe Manchin. So can you reflect a little bit about that? And I have to say, I find him very confusing. He makes different kinds of statements. Some of them make sense to me. Some of them I can't see where they're coming from. Some I just don't understand because he just got reelected and is a pretty safe seat for a while at least. So can you discuss the Senate in general, and then why we're all paying attention to Joe Manchin?
One thing to say about the Senate in general is that there have been a lot of complaints about the obvious disproportionality of the system of representation in the Senate. That was a deal that was cut by the founders of the Constitution in order to get small states on board. And so in some sense, it's natural that we want to undo that arrangement after so many years and such a changed political environment and national history. But historically, it's clear, that allowance was made in order to try and knit the country together. But one of the important things that's happened to the Senate, I think, is that the 6-year terms were intended to give senators some independence from their electorate and from their party. And if you think back over the history of the Senate, at least in a idealized version, we think about the giant political figures who were in the Senate and basically had a lot of latitude to do what they thought was right for the country. Nowadays, Senate elections look much more like presidential elections and House elections. They're governed mostly by the partisanship of the state rather than by anything about the particular qualities of the candidates. There's much less individual variability in Senate outcomes than there used to be. And so maybe in part for that reason, senators are acting more like House members in terms of being pretty reliable voters for their party's policy agenda on most issues, but not always. As I said in my presentation, they have a good deal of latitude to deviate when they think that what their party is pushing is not in the country's interest. And I guess that's mostly my interpretation of Senator Manchin. I mean, I don't know him personally or know his convictions in a lot of detail, but it seems to me that he's mostly operating on the basis of his convictions about good policy. If we look at any particular elected official's convictions, they probably aren't going to match up exactly either with their party's platform or with any overarching ideological philosophy about government. And I'm not sure if Manchin is really any different from others in that respect. But as you say, his peculiarities are going to get a lot more attention in the years to come, given his strategic position in the lineup of the Senate.
Now, were you saying in your presentation was one of the underlying arguments is that Trump or some would the Republican would have done as well in 2016 or could have come as close? I mean, how much of that election and the closeness of the 2020 election was about him, and how much is it just about the kind of the natural polarization that we're seeing with the members and with the public? How much does he matter in particular?
Well, leading up to the 2016 election, the conventional wisdom was that he would matter a lot. Political scientists have these statistical models to predict election outcomes based on historical patterns of the relationship, for example, between economic conditions in the country and how well the incumbent party does. And those assessments, those predictions in the run-up to the 2016 election suggested that the outcome would be quite close. And even a lot of the people who had designed and implemented those models said, well, this is what the model predicts, but of course, we don't believe this is true. We think Trump is going to lose because he's such a bad candidate. But the level of polarization is such that that turned out not to make much difference. We don't have, obviously, an exact measure of how some other Republican nominee would have done, but the pattern of support for Trump was very much in keeping with what we've seen for previous recent Republican nominees.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely critical. As much damage as Trump has done, and whatever your feelings about him, he is mirror of us, what we are as a people, how polarized we are. So I'll just have one more question, and then we've got some good ones coming in our Q&A. So my question is, this is something that troubles me a lot, is, and especially as I watched people refuse to wear masks and all the kind of partisanship that has invaded the public health matter of, beating this pandemic is, I sometimes think that all the sacrifices that our parents, our grandparents made during the Second World War, I think about all of that. And I wonder if Americans are capable of sacrificing for each other, and for a big effort. Would they ever ration, build community gardens, obey the draft? Is there anything? I thought it would be the pandemic. I thought the pandemic would start to push on this polarization a little bit and give people something like a Soviet Union, to be against. But between the set in partisanship and this, disinterest in each other, that's what kind of keeps me up at night. I'm sure you've thought about this a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at data on people's responses to the pandemic in the very early months, they really weren't very differentiated on the basis of partisanship. But then as the president began to make it a political issue, Republicans responded and their views changed pretty significantly over a period of a couple of months. And so it became much more polarized than it maybe would have been if the leadership in the country had handled it in a different way. People feel strongly about a lot of things, and if you can connect your project, whatever it is that you want them to do, to those values, I think you'll have considerable success. The sort of struggle for unity, I think, is more of an uphill struggle now than it has been for some time because of the social change that we've seen over the last half century and the impact that's had on some people's views of what America is and who Americans are. As bad as the current political situation is, I like to tell people, in my view at least, it's a big improvement over the 1950s when we were systematically oppressing African Americans. And in a sense, the troubles that we have now are a reflection of the social progress that the nation has made over the last half century.
Yeah, folks, we have not hit bottom, not even close to, let's say, 1850s. We've had some pretty low moments. Okay, well, let's go to some of the questions. And by the way, I think I had some students look at this in a, kind of casual way, but I think that Political scientists, sociologists are going to, in the future, look very closely at those months, April, May, June of 2020 to figure out, look back, figure out how the pandemic became so politicized, and what Trump was saying, what others were saying, and how we got so divided even over that. In March of 2020, I think everyone's head was spinning, but April, May, June, it started to happen pretty quickly.
When Chris Achen and I were working on Democracy for Realists, we did some analysis at one point of voters' responses to the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918. We were interested in how people hold political leaders accountable or not. And in that case, it was striking that there seemed to be really no political cost to the incumbent leaders from this huge health disaster. And so in the early days of the pandemic, as probably the world's leading authority on electoral responses to pandemics, I very confidently told journalists who asked me that this had become so polarized so quickly that of course Trump would be punished for mishandling the pandemic in such a dramatic way. And in fact, there seemed to be very little of that in the election. And so I think partisan polarization trumped even that very basic kind of accountability.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. All right, well, let's go to some of the questions. We got a lot of them now, and you've got a bonus here. You've got another political scientist who asked a question, Bob Shapiro. I think that's you at Columbia, or it could be another Bob Shapiro, in which case, excuse me. But Robert Shapiro writes, what's your view of all the political electoral reforms that have been proposed to mitigate partisan conflict? So open, or what they're sometimes called jungle primaries, term limits, including ranked choice voting, mandatory voting. Do we need reforms bearing on the mass media and social media? Okay, that's a hard one, which is quadruple barreled or something like that. But Larry, you've thought about all these things, so you go ahead and take a crack at it.
Hi, Bob. My sense is that our attitudes about reform are mostly shaped by hopes than by reliable evidence about how they'd actually work. There have been some studies of changes in the primary process in California and other places that were intended to mitigate polarization. And my sense of the evidence is that they really haven't succeeded very well. They haven't made very much difference. Term limits, I think, are probably actually pernicious because the evidence that we have suggests that what they mostly do is take power away from elected officials and give it to unelected staffs and lobbyists who have more influence over new elected officials than they would over those who had more experience and more expertise. Reforms of the media and social media, I think, are very complicated. It's hard to know what those reforms would consist of. There's certainly a lot to dislike about the media. I have to say that one of the things that I found dispiriting about the Trump administration is that the natural reaction of journalists to a president who did what President Trump did was to make them even more hated by people who were Trump supporters. There's been a growing partisan gap over the last 30 years in attitudes toward the mainstream media, and that's accelerated under President Trump. I think it's also troubling that we college professors are now wrapped up in that same partisan divide. The differences in assessments of college professors among Republicans and Democrats are quite stark. And so if the people who are supposed to be the umpires of reality in society are voluntarily or involuntarily on one side of the political divide, I think that makes things very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot. I think the media are very difficult to regulate, and I kind of lean, free speech absolutist. But by the time students get to college, they're already formed in a lot of ways. I mean, we can do a lot of good in terms of helping them with what we used to call media literacy. Now we call it digital literacy. I think it has to start sooner. It has to start in K to 12. I think there are ways to teach students to be more critical, more analytic of what they're seeing and where they get their information. And this is a very common thing political scientists do in the last chapter of their books, which I'm actually doing in my current book, which is to throw the thing back to high school, middle school and high school teachers to try to teach people how to be citizens. Not just teach them there are three branches of government, and this is what the House does, and this is what the Senate does, but actually what it means to be a citizen and why we want to protect democracy. Okay, how about Joshua Douglas asks, he says, is it not obvious that the Republicans use cultural issues in order to get people to vote against their economic issues? What's the matter with Kansas? That book of a few years ago. How about what's the matter with America? Exclamation mark. And now they have them voting against the interests of their own planet, sigh. So this is the, this timeless question in political theory and political practice of how it is people can't see their own best self-interest and get distracted by that. In this case, cultural issues, asks Joshua.
I wrote an article called "What's the Matter with Kansas?" So I have specific complaints about Frank's argument, but I think the more relevant general point here is that people care about different things. Economic self-interest is one of them, but we all have lots of values that we attach great importance to, sometimes even if they contradict our economic self-interest. And so to denigrate people who make that kind of choice of priorities, I think, is a mistake. There are obviously lots of affluent liberals who support tax increases on themselves because they think it's a good thing for the country. And similarly, people on the other side who have these cultural attitudes often decide that their cultural values are more important than whether the economy grows or exactly what the unemployment rate is. You can say that that's peculiar and maybe counterproductive. I wrote an article called "Homer Gets a Tax Cut" that criticized the thinking of people who were supporting the Bush tax cut in 2001 and 2003. But in a broad sense, I think we have to recognize that our fellow citizens are going to have different priorities and concerns, and they're going to act on the basis of those in the same way that we act on the basis of ours.
But cable news, at least, and especially Fox, they're going with the culture war. I mean, this is, I don't think we've seen the height of it yet. It's gotten, it has its absurdist moments. For example, scolding the Dr. Seuss Foundation for trying to, make some changes they thought were appropriate at this time, and other attacks on private industry and their desire to change their products. But yeah, clearly, Tucker Carlson is the intellectual leader of the right, from what I can tell right now, because I don't really hear it much from, I mean, there are some senators that are outspoken, but in terms of, having an hour every night, to lay out what viewers should think about, worry about, and be really angry about, he's the one to watch, and it's super interesting, and it's worrisome depending on where you sit.
I think it's important that, excuse me, I was just going to say, I think it's important that we have these self-reinforcing media worlds, and another contributor to the overall trend in partisan polarization is almost certainly the extent to which people can choose media outlets that fit their existing political views and reinforce their existing political views. When cable television came along, some people thought it was going to be a great boon for democracy because instead of having three more or less similar half-hour news programs, we'd have a great diversity of content. One thing that happened was that a lot of people who had no interest in politics and didn't really want to watch the half hour of evening news could spend their time looking at Jeopardy or gardening programs or anything other than politics. And so there were some people who were, I think, more disengaged as a result of that development than they had been before. But among the people who were attentive to politics, I think it mostly inspired them to choose up sides even more resolutely than they had previously.
Yeah, absolutely. We watch Jeopardy every night, so I'm not giving that up, but I take in a lot of news anyway. But Marshall McLuhan, for those of you who are old enough to remember him or heard about him, he argued that television, he was writing about television because it was in the 60s and 70s, would enable the global village. I mean, that terminology is his, and that people would empathize with each other more, they would care about each other more, they would come together more. And media took the opposite path. It became more segmented, which he couldn't quite see. And therefore, people could live in their bubbles and have their media that they turn to and really, never see much else, and lots of different opportunities to build your bubble. David Ferris writes in, isn't it a big surprise that January 6th escalated so quickly to violence in a democratic, quote unquote, country?
We'd like to think so, because the US has been a quote unquote stable democracy for such a long time that we sort of let fall off our radar the fact that democratic systems pretty frequently run into these kinds of upsets. One of the more interesting recent books in political science, I think, is a book by Suzanne Mettler and Robert Lieberman called Four Threats, which is a kind of series of sketches of historical periods in American history where democracy was significantly threatened. They have a chapter about the election of 1800 and the early polarization in right after the Constitution was adopted that we've talked about. They have a chapter on the run up to the Civil War. There's a chapter on the Gilded Age in the late 19th century and so on. And I think reading through that kind of summary account of American history reminds us that, the path has in the past sometimes been pretty bumpy, and it shouldn't be as surprising as it is to us that we have these kinds of difficulties.
Yeah, we keep getting surprised by populism and by faux populism, which is, I think, more appropriate for at least this past administration. And students often ask me, why don't we learn from history? We've had these bad periods of polarization, or populism, whatnot. And I say, societies, people might be able to learn from their personal or family history, but for a whole society that's changing all the time, with new populations, immigrants, changing demographic patterns. It's hard for a society to learn because people keep getting replaced, and the entity of society keeps getting more complicated. But something to ponder. Dr. Rubin writes in, does the GOP have a future? Will it go the way of the Whigs? They're so irrational now.
I think it's unlikely that the party will go away. The electoral institutions that we have are so structured to advantage the two existing major parties, but it is possible that the party would break up in such a spectacular way that another party would be formed. But that party would, I think, for the most part, probably, at least for the time being, reproduce a lot of the same things that I gather you dislike about the contemporary Republican Party. The fact is, there's a big constituency out there for that right now. And so I don't think we're going to legislate it out of existence simply by doing away with the Republican Party brand name.
Now, I'm sure this is on the list somewhere. We have a lot of questions, but why is it so hard to start a third party in the United States? You hear this now and then. No one really takes it seriously. I often listen to The Bulwark, which is a really good podcast I recommend to people. And these are, sort of centrist Republicans who have been so angry with the Trump administration, they've left. Some of them became Democrats. Some of them are just nothing now. And there's a lot of those kind of intellectuals discussing the idea of a third party. But in the United States, at least, in the mid to late 20th century now, it seems impossible. Larry, do you want to reflect a little bit on that? Because I'm sure that's on people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult for a third party to get a foothold in a system that is run by majoritarian principles. You have to displace one of the major parties and actually beat the other one in order to actually get represented, and that's a very difficult thing to do. The other difficulty, though, I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that it's really hard to come up with a package of values and policy positions that's going to appeal to a large enough number of people to be a successful major party. If you look at these proposals for third parties, almost invariably they are the new second party, the new major party in the system should have exactly the platform that I personally think would be the right platform for the country. And it's very well tailored to do that, but it's not well tailored to actually generate support from a wide swath of the public. If one of the major parties does get to the point where it can't successfully appeal to large numbers of people, there's a big incentive for the politicians associated with that party to change their product in one way or another. And that's mostly what we've seen in previous instances in American history where a party has really failed in a spectacular way, a kind of takeover in spirit, even if the name remains the same.
It feels very, I think, chicken and egg, like, the party has to fail, and not get a lot of votes to start to decline, where people see opportunity for a new party, but it's hard to see where that starts, on which side that starts, with the politicians or with the people and the mechanics of that.
Can I interrupt 1 minute?
Sure.
I'm getting word that people are still having some difficulty with your audio, Larry. So I think your mic have to talk more directly into your microphone. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
that's okay. Thank you. That's right. People can't hear me.
Sid Madison asks about other democracies and whether they have this kind of similar dynamic with polarization. What countries do you look to as? Let me, Sid, if you don't mind, let me broaden this a little bit and ask you, Larry, which contemporary countries have a pretty darn good democracy? One that looks a lot better than ours in terms of representation and productivity when it comes to making public policy, and civility, all the things that we dream about now. Who's doing it right?
I think until fairly recently, most people would have pointed to Europe. There's a lot of enthusiasm, especially on the left, for social democratic government in Europe. But I have to say, for the last few years now, I've actually been working on a book on politics in Europe, and my impression is that they're not so different from us in a couple of respects. One is with respect to the rise of right-wing populism. There's been a lot of talk about an explosion of right-wing populism in Europe, but if you look at the survey data, it turns out that the sentiments of ordinary citizens are almost exactly what they have been for the last 20 years. And what's happened in some countries is that political leaders have, as they have in a rather different way in the US, exploited that pre-existing sentiment more effectively than they had previously. The other important contrast here, I think, is in terms of the level of political inequality. I've done research on the connection between economic inequality and political inequality in the United States and found really substantial, frightening disparities in responsiveness to the preferences of affluent people and poor people. And most of that literature has focused on the US, but at some point I got the bright idea that it would be interesting to see what things look like in other places where democracy supposedly works better. And so I've looked at countries outside the US, mostly affluent democracies, and other people have done pretty detailed studies of places like Sweden and Germany that have very different institutions and very different political cultures, and found that the level of political inequality in those places seems to be generally pretty similar to what it is in the United States. And so it may be that this is another one of those endemic problems that every democracy has, but we sometimes choose not to pay attention to.
There are, parts of, obviously we have a long way to go in terms of, closing income gaps and opportunity gaps where they're extreme. But, clearly the Biden people with the infrastructure bill are trying to get at some of that through, for example, the child tax credit. You see anything else in that legislation that would put us on a better road? I mean, clearly, the Biden people see what you're talking about. I mean, they understand that what they can do, what they can get through Congress is another story. But you see anything else in that legislation that?
I think there's a lot of stuff, not only in the pandemic relief bill, but also in the broader infrastructure bill that's intended to have that kind of effect indirectly. I think Democratic political leaders have mostly decided that this is not a winning issue to tackle head on, and that they're going to be more effective tackling it indirectly. And so, for example, President Obama, who talked a lot about inequality, made his most significant dent in inequality not by trying to directly change the tax rate or anything, but rather through the Affordable Care Act, which took a lot of money from affluent people in terms of taxes and gave it to poorer people in the form of healthcare subsidies. It wasn't billed or mostly debated as a inequality relief measure, but in substantial part, that's what it was. And I think a lot of the Biden administration policies, if they're successful, will have similar kinds of effects.
It is it's a strange turn from, say, the 60s, from the New Deal, from the 60s with LBJ, the war on poverty. That's not political rhetoric that the Democrats feel works anymore. I mean, hence Biden coming at a lot of these issues through infrastructure. I mean, a lot of the infrastructure bill is about, bridges and roads and that sort of thing. Coming from Connecticut, we're hopeless on the roads, but hopefully people will benefit from it. But they're trying to tuck all the inequality stuff in that because they see it's unfashionable to do anything else, or it's not going to work.
I think it's worth saying that this isn't a new problem either. If you look back to the 1960s, some of the policies that LBJ pursued were quite popular, but the war on poverty wasn't. Martin Gillens wrote a terrific book about political inequality in which he tried to assess the relationship between the preferences of citizens and policy outcomes in the US from 1980 to 2000, roughly. I forget the exact years. And the picture was pretty depressing. And so then he went back to the 1960s, I think with the idea that there would be much more evidence of responsiveness there, and found that there really wasn't, that a lot of the stuff that was being passed in that day was not popular with the public, but the Democrats had huge majorities in Congress, and so they could pass what they wanted.
Mhm.
In retrospect, much of it became more popular than it was at the time, although the war on poverty probably still isn't
Mhm.
all that popular in many people's imagination. And if you look back to the New Deal, there was a lot of that in the New Deal as well, that the
Mhm.
most progressive parts of FDR's agenda were things that he was pushing hard for against public sentiment rather than being pushed by the public.
Yeah, no, and a lot of stuff that he wanted to do, just he could not get past. Lee Whedon asks, Salvation from the Browning of America should have been written Salvation of Democracy by and because of the Browning America, e.g. recent gubernatorial and senatorial elections where more Democratic officials were elected. Okay, I'm a little, Lee, if you want to write in and reframe that a little bit, that'd be good.
Well, I mean, it's the case that the increasing diversity of the electorate has advantaged the Democratic Party in terms of the numbers of people in the electorate. It's not quite so clear to me that that's been an overall advantage, because I think it's also contributed significantly to this backlash on the part of more conservative whites who are made uncomfortable by that social change.
And there is this, we don't know a lot about it yet, but Trump did pretty well in a lot of pockets of Latino voters, and the Republican Party feels like they could build that strength. So, we'll see if they can. But that was one of the more interesting parts of the election outcome in 2020, how much traction Republicans can get there.
Yes, and these calculations that people make about the demography of the future and when we'll become a majority minority society depends a lot on who you consider a minority and who considers themselves to be minorities. And so I think the Republican hope is that Latinos will come to think of themselves increasingly as undifferentiated whites rather than specifically as people of color, and that their political views will be shaped by that identity.
Excellent. Yeah. So Ronald writes in, Ronald Mertens, is there a lack of intra-party policy disagreement due to the over-reliance on party whips enforcing policy, discipline, subject to external lobbying? Would more debate within respective parties create more capacity to negotiate legislation between the two parties? I don't know. There's some intra-party policy disagreement on the left. I don't know about what's going on with Republicans, but go ahead.
Well, no, I think that's true on both sides. I mean, I haven't yet read Speaker Boehner's book, which just came out, but my impression is that most of it is his complaints about how hard it was to try and hold together this increasingly unruly Republican caucus in Congress. So there was a lot of disagreement there. It may be that they need better mechanisms for deliberating that would somehow translate that disagreement into a position that would be more constructive in terms of inter-party bargaining. But I think the reality is that the gulf between the parties' positions at this point is, on most issues, quite broad.
So we have a few questions that touch on this business about facts, that if we can't even agree on facts, Democrats, Republicans, others, then how can we build political debate, or how can we, develop proper public policy if we can't actually agree on data and empirical reality? And yes, everyone who wrote that in, that is one of the more troubling things that's going on right now. Larry, another thing that keeps you up at night?
Yes. I don't have anything to say by way of constructive solutions, but it is a big problem. I mean, in some sense, it's not new either. There's always been empirical disagreement about facts, but I think it's gone broader and deeper recently than it has been for a long time.
Larry, I think one of the most profound things on your slides is where you said, the problem is so deep that Republicans and Democrats don't even agree on what politics is for anymore. I forget your exact words. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's really getting to, I think, the base of a lot of our, more surface level discussions, and, very profoundly worried.
Well, I was trying to summarize that pattern that I showed in terms of the relative importance of the different bundles of attitudes and values among Democrats and Republicans. On the Democratic side, people mostly seem to care about, and their political views are mostly propelled by attitudes about the role of government and the economy and the environment and regulation. Whereas for Republicans, those things just aren't so important, and they care about these cultural values. And so when you say to them, how can you vote against your economic interest and support this party that's run by and for plutocrats? Their answer is, these are the people who are speaking for my deeply held cultural values.
We had a few people mention the media and complaints with journalists. And as you said, Larry, people are getting even more skeptical of mainstream media and journalists. I have to say, for the first time in my career these last few years, I've actually felt sympathy for the White House press corps and journalists in trying to figure out, how to cover the Trump administration in a way that was, fair and civil and rigorous, given the kind of the head spinning news cycles constantly, and when something would go wrong for the Trump people, it was we were onto something else, another horrible thing or another incredibly distracting thing. And I think the field of journalism, they got a lot of really hard thinking to do, and they've got to do it in real time. You know, the people who understand this the best are in the trenches doing the day-to-day coverage. You know, you've got the kind of the retired journalists who write for the Atlantic and all, who can, you know, sit back and think about the big picture. But I think practically speaking, journalists have got to help us and, you know, and get some help themselves in tackling these issues about, for example, do we have the same facts? What are the facts? Which is, you know, I hate to put this on them and teachers, but, you know, I'm not exactly sure where else to put it. But, you know, it was interesting to watch them struggle with it early on. You know, they tried to, they didn't want to say Trump lied. They didn't want to use the word lie. And then they, you know, slowly disabuse themselves of that. But they had other such struggles, and it's been hard to watch because we need them. You know, we need them more than ever. So maybe let me get one more.
If I can just say, it seems to me that a lot of what happens in Washington is based on assumptions about norms that we've increasingly come to see as less powerful and reliable than we had imagined. And the working behavior of the press is one of those. Their norms are built for a world in which political leaders, you know, are constrained by the truth and have some shame and expect to be punished if they violate too spectacularly the existing norms. And Trump simply demonstrated that those norms aren't nearly as powerful as we imagined. And so journalists spent a lot of time complaining about his behavior, not surprisingly. And people who were Trump supporters took that as yet further evidence of how biased the media are, not surprisingly.
Well, Larry, I think we're mostly out of questions. Let me ask you the last question, and I know you're going to hate this, but I don't know, you're better than, you could have a better shot at answering this than any of the rest of us, except for Bob probably has a good answer too. But I mean, if you had to predict in 2 years where we'd be, which legislative initiatives do you think Biden will be successful on, which type, not particular legislation? And is he going to lose House, Senate, both, neither? So just those two. So electoral success, as you know, manifest in the House and Senate, and policy success. And we won't hold you to it, but
in terms of policy, the pattern increasingly seems to be to stuff as much as you can into a relatively small number of bills. And so I think once whatever infrastructure bill is passed, that will probably constitute most of the legislative accomplishments of the Biden administration.
what about the voting rights, the various voting rights initiatives, pieces of legislation?
It seems unlikely to me that anything along the broad lines that have been proposed will pass, and maybe that some much narrower pieces of it will get through, but I guess I would be surprised even by that. In terms of election outcomes, I want to go back to the broad point that I made at the beginning, that election outcomes are mostly coin tosses. And so, first of all, that makes them hard to predict. And secondly, it means that we shouldn't attach much broad philosophical meaning to the result. The usual pattern is for the president's party to lose seats, mostly because there's almost always an ideological reaction to the perception of policy change. And so, insofar as President Biden is successful in pushing through policies, I think that will probably turn out to be costly in the midterm.
Yeah, and he doesn't have seats. He doesn't have many seats to lose. You know, certainly not in the Senate and the House. That's a very small margin now as well. Well, thanks everybody. I know that you can't clap for Larry because I think you're all muted. So I will. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
So Rhoda, back to you.
Back to me. Where's my video? Here I am. Yeah, so I want to clap too. And I think the audience is clapping because this was a powerful evening with a lot of good information and wonderful discussion. So very provocative. You leave us with a lot of stuff to think about and worry about. So thank you so much. It was an honor to have you both. And to the audience still in the room, I hope you'll tune in to us in May, where we're doing a program on jobs and jobs of the future. And in June, we're going to cover the contentious issues of immigration. So stay tuned to NFRPP, check us out, and you will find some really terrific programs coming up in the future. Thank you again, dear people. It was just an honor to have you join us. Thank you. And good night.